It started with the earrings. They weren't expensive, just a pair of delicate silver hoops I'd bought on a whim at a street market downtown. But they were mine. I'd left them on my bathroom counter that morning, and by the time my parents had picked up my two younger siblings from another long day of babysitting, they were gone. I searched the bathroom first, then my bedroom, then my jewelry box, but they had vanished. I knew I hadn't misplaced them. I never misplace things. The couch cushions still bore faint smears of peanut butter, a trail of crackers led to my room, and the once pristine corners of my apartment were littered with toy cars and crumpled juice boxes. But it was the missing earrings that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the first time something of mine had disappeared after babysitting, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the toys or the chaos. It wasn't the sticky handprints on my walls or the fact that my parents had, once again, shown up an hour late with nothing more than a shrug and a vague apology. No, this time it was a gut feeling, a flicker of something deeper. For years, I'd told myself it was easier to just give in. My parents needed me. The kids needed me. I'd swallowed their dismissive comments, endured their casual disregard, and let them invade my life under the guise of family helping family. But now, standing in the middle of the mess they'd left behind, I felt something shift inside me. And I wasn't sure if it was anger or fear. "I'm not babysitting again until we set some rules," I told my parents the next morning, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. My mother glanced up from her coffee, her expression hovering between surprise and irritation. "Rules?" "Yes," I said. "From now on, if I babysit, there are conditions. I want to be paid. I want the kids picked up on time. And I want my property respected. If they take something..." "Take something?" My mother interrupted, a sharp laugh escaping her lips. "What are you talking about?" "Something went missing yesterday," I said evenly. "My earrings." "Oh, for God's sake, you're not accusing the kids, are you?" Her tone was airy, dismissive, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp and defensive, that made me pause. "They were there in the morning, and now they're gone," I replied. "I don't know who took them, but..." "Stop," she snapped, her hand coming down hard on the table. "You're being ridiculous." Her reaction was too fast, too pointed. My father, who had been quietly reading the paper, lowered it just enough to glance between us, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm not babysitting until you agree to my terms," I said firmly, ignoring the knot forming in my throat. "And what if we don't?" my mother asked, leaning back in her chair. "Then you'll have to find someone else," I said. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the kitchen clock. My mother's gaze never left mine, and behind her calm exterior, I could sense a tension she didn't want to reveal. "That's fine," she said finally, her voice clipped. "We'll find someone else." But as I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over. Not really. Because there was something my mother wasn't saying. Something that made my skin prickle. And for the first time, I wondered if this wasn't just about earrings or boundaries or even babysitting. For the first time, I wondered if I really knew my family at all. The text started innocently enough. "Hey, sweetie, can you watch the kids this weekend? We've got a fundraiser and the sitter canceled." I stared at my phone, reading the message twice. It was the first time they'd asked since our argument over the new terms. It felt like a test, a thinly veiled attempt to gauge whether I'd cave. I typed out a polite but firm reply. "Sorry, I can't this weekend. Hope you find someone." An hour later, my mother called. I could tell from the clipped tone of her hi that she wasn't calling to chat. "You really can't help this weekend?" she asked, skipping any pretense of small talk. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't," I said again, forcing calm into my voice. "I already made plans." "Plans?" she repeated, her voice sharpening. "What plans? You don't have kids or a family. What could possibly be more important than helping us?" The words landed like a slap. "I don't need to justify my plans to you," I said evenly, my grip tightening on the phone. Her silence was loud, like the intake of breath before a storm. "I don't understand what's gotten into you lately," she said finally. "This isn't how we raised you. Family is supposed to come first." There it was, the guilt card, expertly played. But I didn't flinch this time. Family goes both ways, Mom, I replied. And I've been putting you first for years. It's not fair to expect me to keep dropping everything whenever you call. Not fair, she scoffed. You don't know the meaning of the word. We've sacrificed everything for you, given you a home, an education, and now you're too good to babysit. I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me without sinking in. I'm not saying I won't help, but if you want me to babysit, it'd have to be on my terms. Otherwise, you'll have to find someone else. The silence that followed was icy. Fine, she said finally, her voice clipped. If that's how you want it. I thought that was the end of it. I thought standing my ground would force them to respect my boundaries. But I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, the subtle manipulations turned into outright hostility. My father stopped calling altogether, and my mother's texts were sparse and laced with passive-aggressive undertones. Since you're too busy for us, I guess we'll just have to figure things out on our own. One read. We've always done so much for you. It's a shame you don't feel the same, said another. The worst came one Sunday afternoon when I ran into them at the grocery store. My siblings were with them, trailing behind like bored shadows. My mother didn't even greet me, her face tight with disapproval. Look who finally has time for family, she said loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. My cheeks burned, but I refused to take the bait. Hi, Mom, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. You know, she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, we had to cancel dinner plans last week because no one was available to watch the kids. I guess some people are just too busy these days. I glanced at my siblings, who looked away awkwardly. My father stood silently beside the cart, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry to hear that, I said simply, though my hands clenched around the basket. Sorry doesn't help, does it? She snapped. But I suppose you wouldn't understand. You've never had real responsibilities. Something inside me cracked. You're right, Mom, I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I don't have kids. But that doesn't mean my time isn't valuable. And it doesn't mean you get to decide what I do with it. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if she wasn't sure how to respond. The tension between us was palpable, a tug-of-war neither of us was willing to lose. Finally, she turned away, muttering something under her breath. I didn't ask her to repeat it. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with messages from her. I can't believe how ungrateful you've become. After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us. But the final message stopped me cold. You're going to regret this. For a moment, I considered calling her, asking what she meant. But then I put the phone down and stared out the window, my heart pounding. This was more than a disagreement now. This was war. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind I rarely got to enjoy. Sunlight streamed through my windows, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. I had just opened my book when the doorbell rang, shattering the peace. I wasn't expecting anyone. Opening the door, I froze. My two younger siblings stood on the porch, backpacks slung over their shoulders, their faces a mixture of confusion and nervousness. Mom said to stay here until she comes back, my 10-year-old brother said, shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. What? I blinked, scanning the street for my parents' car. It was already gone. When is she coming back? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't say, my younger sister muttered, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. My heart sank as I looked at the two of them. This wasn't the first time my parents had dropped them off unannounced, but it was the first time they'd done so without even a text or a call. Come inside, I said, ushering them in. I tried calling my mother first. No answer. Then my father. Straight to voicemail. Panic mixed with anger as the minutes ticked by. I couldn't believe they'd done this. Again. But this time felt different. More deliberate, more reckless. An hour passed. Then 2. Are you hungry? I asked the kids, masking my frustration with a smile. They nodded, and I busied myself in the kitchen, my mind racing. Where had my parents gone? When would they be back? Did they even plan to come back today? Another hour passed, and my attempts to reach them continued to fail. That's when I made the call. When the police arrived, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my hands trembled as I spoke. They dropped the kids off without telling me, I said. I haven't been able to reach them, and I have no idea when they'll be back. The officer, a woman with kind eyes and a steady presence, nodded as she took notes. Has this happened before? Not like this, I admitted, glancing at my siblings, who sat quietly on the couch, their eyes wide and uncertain. We'll try to contact your parents, the officer said, her voice firm but gentle. In the meantime, it's good you called. This is a serious matter. It was another 2 hours before my parents arrived. My mother stormed up the driveway, her face flushed with anger, while my father trailed behind her, his expression carefully blank. What the hell is this? She snapped, glaring at the police officers standing on my porch. This is about your decision to leave your children unattended without consent, the officer replied calmly. Do you realize how dangerous that was? They weren't unattended, my mother shot back. They were with their sister. Without her knowledge or agreement, the officer corrected. That's child abandonment under state law. My mother's mouth opened and closed, her anger shifting into a mix of indignation and embarrassment. This is ridiculous. We're their parents. We were only gone for a few hours. That's no excuse, the officer said firmly. Next time, you need to communicate and ensure there's a responsible adult willing to take care of them. Otherwise, we'll have to escalate this matter. As the officer continued speaking, my mother turned to me, her eyes blazing. You called the police? Yes, I did, I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. You can't just drop them off without telling me. I had no idea where you were or when you'd be back. I can't believe you'd do this to us, she hissed, her voice low and furious. No, I said, my voice firm. I can't believe you'd do this to them. They deserve better than to be left on a doorstep like luggage. My mother's face reddened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But the officer's presence kept her in check. After the police left, the tension in my apartment was suffocating. My parents gathered the kids without another word, their silence heavier than any argument. You'll regret this, my mother said finally, her voice a cold whisper. Maybe, I replied, standing my ground. But I'm not the one who's wrong here. As the door closed behind them, I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. It wasn't an easy decision to call the police, but it was the right one. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my siblings and myself from their recklessness. And as the silence of my apartment settled around me, I knew there was no going back. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for gratitude, but walking into my parents' house felt like stepping into a powder keg. I had only come out of obligation, not a genuine desire to celebrate. My siblings had begged me to be there, their voices hesitant and hopeful on the phone. It won't be the same without you, they'd said. But as I sat at the long dining table, the turkey steaming in the center and my mother flitting between the kitchen and dining room, I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. You're quiet, my father said, breaking the uneasy silence as he carved the turkey. His voice was pointed, as if my quietness was an offense in itself. I'm just tired, I replied, forcing a polite smile. He grunted, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. Tired from what? You're living on your own, free from responsibilities. My mother's fork clinked against her plate, but she said nothing, keeping her eyes on the food. I have a job, Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the bubbling frustration. And I'm not free from responsibilities. I just don't let them consume me. He set down the knife, leaning forward with a hard stare. Maybe it's time you stop playing this game and come home. Contribute to this family for once. I blinked, caught off guard. Contribute? I've been contributing my entire life. Not enough, he snapped. You left, and now everything's on us. Your mother is stretched thin, and I'm working overtime. And here you are, acting like you don't owe us anything. I don't owe you my life, I said, my voice sharper now. I've helped, I've sacrificed, and I've put up with more than you can imagine. But I'm not coming back to be your free labor. Watch your tone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. No, I said, standing. I've watched it long enough. You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to dump your responsibilities on me and call it family. The room fell silent, my siblings staring at their plates, their small faces pale. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his hand slamming against the table. You think you're better than us now? He growled, his voice shaking with rage. I think I deserve to live my own life, I shot back. That's when it happened. He lunged, his hand reaching for my arm, but I was ready. Maybe I'd been ready my entire life. I stepped back, twisting out of his grip and planting myself firmly between the table and the door. Don't you dare, I said, my voice steady and loud, carrying more authority than I'd ever heard from myself. His eyes blazed with fury, but something in my stance made him hesitate. My siblings were frozen, their wide eyes darting between us. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. Both of you, stop, she cried, stepping between us. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. The fragile facade of family unity had shattered, exposing years of control, neglect, and resentment. You want me to come back and fix your mess? I said, glaring at my father. That's not happening. I'm done. Done with your manipulation, your entitlement, and your belief that I owe you something just because you're my parents. You ungrateful. No, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his. This ends now. I grabbed my coat, my legs trembling as I moved toward the door. My siblings' eyes pleaded with me, but I couldn't stay. Not in that house, not in that storm. Don't come back, my father spat as I opened the door. I paused, looking back at the family I had fought so hard to hold on to. That's up to you, I said quietly, stepping into the cold night air. The drive home was a blur, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I replayed the scene in my head. My father's rage, my mother's silence, my siblings' fear, it all weighed on me like a lead blanket. But as the city lights came into view, a strange calm settled over me. I had defended myself. I had stood my ground. And though it hurt, I knew it was the only way to break free. This Thanksgiving had exposed the truth. My family's love came with conditions. And I wasn't willing to pay the price anymore. The call came late at night, jolting me awake. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the screen. My mother's name glowed against the darkness. Something in my chest tightened. She rarely called me anymore, and when she did, it was never good. Hello? Are you happy now? My mother's voice hissed through the receiver, raw with grief and accusation. Mom? What's going on? It's your fault, she said, her voice breaking. If you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. If you'd just cared about your family. I sat up, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? What happened? It's the baby, she choked out. The baby's gone. My mind raced. My younger sister had been pregnant, a surprise for the whole family. She was too young, but everyone had rallied around her, making plans for the new arrival. Well, almost everyone. I'd been wary of how much responsibility they'd pile onto her without addressing the deeper dysfunction in our family. Now, none of that mattered. Mom, I'm so sorry, I said softly. What happened? She tripped on the porch, my mother snapped. The same porch I asked you to help fix months ago. If you'd been here, you could have prevented this. I froze, the accusation hanging in the air like a slap. Mom, you know that's not fair, I said, keeping my voice measured. I didn't even know the porch was still broken. You didn't know because you left, she fired back. You abandoned us, just like you always do. And now look what's happened. My hands tightened around the phone. I left because you kept expecting me to fix everything for you. That porch? That was Dad's responsibility. Not mine. You selfish, she began, but her voice cracked. I'm not selfish, I said, my voice rising. I've spent my whole life cleaning up your messes. And now you're blaming me for something you didn't take care of? That's not fair, Mom. Silence. For a moment, I thought she'd hung up, but then her breath hitched on the other end. You'll never understand what it's like to lose a child, she said finally, her voice cold and distant. No, I said softly, my throat tightening. But I know what it's like to lose myself trying to live up to your expectations. Over the next few days, the house became a vortex of grief and anger. My sister retreated into silence, her pain palpable but private. My father threw himself into work, leaving early and returning late, barely speaking a word. And my mother, she became a whirlwind of blame. Whenever I visited, her words were barbed, dripping with resentment. "It's good of you to stop by, considering how busy you are," she'd say, her tone cutting. She refused to acknowledge the broken porch as the real cause of the accident. Instead, she twisted the narrative, painting me as the negligent one, the outsider who had failed her family when they needed me most. "It's easier to blame me than to face the truth, isn't it?" I said one afternoon, unable to hold my tongue any longer. "The truth," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "The truth is, you could have been here. You could have helped. But you chose yourself." For once, I shot back. And I'm not sorry for that. The room fell silent, the air between us heavy with years of unspoken resentment. As the weeks passed, the cracks in their facade grew deeper. My mother buried herself in obsessive cleaning, scrubbing the house as if she could erase the pain. My father avoided home entirely, his absence louder than words. And my sister. One evening, as I sat with her in her dimly lit room, she finally spoke. "They knew the porch was dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I told them, and they said it wasn't a priority." My chest tightened. "You told them?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was carrying groceries. I tripped on the loose board. If they'd listened." I pulled her into a hug, her sobs shaking us both. "They'll never take responsibility," I said quietly, stroking her hair. "But you don't have to carry their guilt. None of this was your fault." Her voice was muffled against my shoulder. "They'll blame you, though." "I know," I said, my own voice breaking. "But I can handle it. Because I'd been carrying their blame for years. And I wasn't going to let them crush her under it too." The miscarriage became another fissure in the fragile foundation of our family. My parents' refusal to take accountability deepened the divide, their coping mechanisms a glaring reflection of their inability to face the truth. And as much as it hurt to watch them unravel, I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't let their dysfunction define me anymore. The pounding on my apartment door came late in the evening, sharp and relentless, like a battering ram against my peace. I set down my tea, my heart already racing. Only one set of people in my life could bring that kind of chaos to my doorstep. Opening the door, I wasn't surprised to see my parents standing there, their faces twisted in anger. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, her expression a storm of grief and fury. My father stood behind her, his jaw tight, a silent shadow to her rage. "You didn't think you could hide from us forever, did you?" my mother spat, pushing past me before I could say a word. My father followed, his silence more ominous than her words. "I didn't know I was hiding," I replied evenly, closing the door and crossing my arms. "What do you want?" "What do we want?" my mother snapped, her voice rising. "We want you to explain yourself. To tell us how you can live with yourself after what you've done." I stared at her, unflinching. "And what exactly have I done, Mom?" "You abandoned us," she said, her voice trembling. "You left when we needed you the most. And now look at what's happened." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. I felt my chest tighten, but I refused to let her see my hurt. "You're blaming me for the miscarriage," I said flatly. "Of course we are," she cried, her voice breaking. "If you had been there, if you hadn't been so selfish, none of this would have happened." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "No, Mom. This happened because you and Dad ignored the warning signs. Because you didn't fix the porch when you knew it was dangerous. Don't put that on me." "How dare you?" she hissed, stepping closer, her finger jabbing the air between us. "You think you're blameless? You think you're better than us now?" "No," I said, my voice rising. "But I'm not going to let you twist this around and make me your scapegoat. I didn't build that porch. I didn't ignore it when it started to fall apart. That was on you. You ungrateful little—" "Enough," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her tirade. "I'm done. Done with your guilt trips, your blame, your refusal to take responsibility for anything. You can't keep showing up here, expecting me to fix your messes and take your abuse." My father finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't speak to your mother like that." I turned to him, my anger bubbling over. Why not? She spent my whole life speaking to me like this. Like I'm some tool to use and discard. Like my time and my life don't matter. He didn't reply, but the tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. This is my home, I continued, my voice unwavering. My space. And if you can't respect that, or me, you can leave. For a moment, the room was silent. My mother's face twisted, her lips trembling as she searched for something to say. My father simply stared at me, his disappointment clear. This is what you want, my mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. To cut ties with your family? To turn your back on us? No, I said quietly. But I can't keep sacrificing myself for people who don't see me, who only see what I can do for them. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice cold. I won't, I replied, holding her gaze. Without another word, she turned and stormed out. My father lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable, before following her. The silence they left behind was deafening. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as the adrenaline faded. It wasn't the first confrontation we'd had, but this one felt different. Final. For years, I had been their scapegoat, their emotional punching bag, their stand-in parent when they didn't want to be. But not anymore. I stared at the closed door, my heart heavy but resolute. This was the cost of standing up for myself, of breaking free from their toxic hold. And as painful as it was, I knew it was worth it. Because for the first time, I wasn't letting them write my story. I was writing my own. It was my youngest brother who reached out first. A text, simple and tentative. Can we come over? Just us? I stared at the message for a while, my thumb hovering over the screen. In all the chaos with my parents, I hadn't had much time to think about how my siblings were processing everything. They'd always been caught in the middle, and I didn't want them to feel like they had to choose sides. Of course, I replied. A few hours later, the knock on my door came, softer than the one that had preceded my parents' confrontation days earlier. I opened it to see my brother and sister standing there, their faces uncertain but hopeful. Come in, I said, stepping aside. They shuffled in, backpacks slung over their shoulders, the same ones they'd carried during that unforgettable drop-off. This time, though, there was no tension, no forced responsibility. I led them to the couch, offering snacks and drinks, and for a while, we just sat, the silence punctuated by the sounds of a movie I'd put on to fill the void. It was my sister who broke the silence. We wanted to say we're sorry, she said, her voice small. I blinked, caught off guard. What? Why? For everything, my brother chimed in, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. For Mom and Dad blaming you. For all the times we made it harder on you. For not saying anything before. My chest tightened as I looked at them, my heart breaking a little. You don't have to apologize, I said softly. None of this is your fault. But it's not yours either, my sister said, her eyes filling with tears. And they act like it is. Like you're the reason everything's messed up, and it's not fair. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I know. And I'm sorry you're stuck in the middle of it all. My brother shifted in his seat, his expression serious. When we were younger, I didn't get why you wanted to leave. I thought you just didn't care about us. But now I get it. They expect too much from you. From all of us. His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd felt like my siblings resented me for leaving, for not being the ever-present big sister they wanted. To hear this now, to know they understood, was overwhelming. I didn't leave because of you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I left because I couldn't keep living like that. I didn't want you to think it was okay to let them treat you that way. My sister wiped at her eyes, nodding. I don't want to stay there forever, she said quietly. When I'm older, I want to leave too. You will, I said firmly. And when you do, I'll be here to help you. My brother looked at me, his gaze steady. You're not coming back, are you? I hesitated, then shook my head. No, I can't. But that doesn't mean I'm not here for you. You can always call me, always come to me. I'll always be your sister. They nodded, the weight of my words settling over the room. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew lighter. We laughed over old family memories, shared stories about school, and even planned a future road trip, just the three of us. For the first time in years, I felt connected to them, not as a stand-in parent or a shield against our parents' wrath, but as their sister. When they left that evening, their hugs lingered, their words of gratitude quiet but sincere. "We're proud of you," my sister whispered as she stepped outside. Those words stayed with me long after the door closed. Over the following weeks, the shifts in our family dynamics became clearer. My siblings started standing up for themselves in small but significant ways, pushing back against unreasonable demands, setting their own boundaries. It wasn't easy for them, but I could see the seeds of change taking root. And though my parents continued to bristle at my absence, the bond one was rebuilding with my siblings gave me hope. Because for the first time, it felt like we weren't just surviving in the shadow of our parents' toxicity. We were learning how to thrive, together, in the light of our own independence. The first letter arrived in a crisp white envelope, the kind that looks innocuous until you spot the return address, a law firm. I stared at it for a moment before tearing it open, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a formal notice, written in cold, impersonal legal jargon. My parents were exploring avenues of compensation for what they claimed were financial burdens I had caused them, medical fees, lost wages, and fines related to the child abandonment incident. I sank onto the couch, rereading the letter to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. They were seriously considering suing me. The absurdity of it hit me first. The idea that they would try to pin their mistakes on me, again, was almost laughable. But then the anger set in, boiling beneath the surface as I picked up my phone to call my lawyer. "That's a weak case at best," my lawyer said when we met later that week. "They can't hold you responsible for medical fees related to your sister's miscarriage. That's on them, especially given the unsafe conditions at their house." "And the child abandonment charges?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "You did the right thing by calling the police," he said firmly. "You were within your rights, and the police report will back that up. If anything, it's a stronger case against them than for them." I nodded, trying to let his reassurances sink in. But there was still a knot of unease in my chest. This wasn't just about money or legalities, it was about control. My parents were using the legal system as another weapon in their arsenal, trying to punish me for stepping out of line. A week later, they escalated. This time, it wasn't a letter, but a phone call. My mother's voice was cold, almost robotic. "You have no idea what you've done to this family," she said. "We've had to hire lawyers, pay fines, and deal with the fallout from your selfish decisions." "You mean your decisions," I corrected. "You've left us no choice," she snapped. "We're filing a formal claim. You'll be hearing from our lawyer soon." I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to stay calm. "Mom, you don't have a case. And even if you did, this is a new low." "A new low," she repeated, her voice rising. "After everything we've done for you, you're going to let us suffer like this?" "You're suffering because of your own actions," I said, my voice steady. "Not mine. And if you think threatening me is going to make me back down, you're wrong." Her silence was icy. "You've changed," she said finally, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're not the daughter we raised." "No," I replied. "I'm not. And that's a good thing." The threats continued for weeks. Letters, calls, even texts from family members urging me to do the right thing and make amends. Each one was a thinly veiled attempt to guilt me into submission. But I didn't waver. I'd prepared for this moment, collecting evidence over the years, their neglect, their manipulation, their reckless decisions. I had copies of texts, police reports, and even photos of the hazardous porch that had caused my sister's miscarriage. My lawyer helped me draft a response to their claims, outlining the evidence against them and making it clear that any legal action on their part would only backfire. When the letter was sent, the silence was deafening. A month later, I received another envelope. This one wasn't from a law firm but from my father. Inside was a single piece of paper with a hastily scrawled note. "We'll drop it, but you've made your point. Don't expect us to forgive this." I stared at the words, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Even in retreat, they couldn't take responsibility. But I didn't need their forgiveness. What I needed, what I deserved, was freedom from their control. And I had finally claimed it. The legal threats were a turning point, a final attempt to break me that had only solidified my resolve. My parents had underestimated me, assuming I'd fold under pressure like I always had. But this time, I had the strength to stand firm, and the support of my siblings, who had begun to distance themselves from our parents' toxic influence. It wasn't the victory I had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. And as I filed their letters away, a record of everything they'd tried to take from me, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. It was a surprise when my mother called. Not the scathing, accusatory texts she'd been sending for weeks, or the icy silence punctuated by legal threats, but a call. A voice. A connection I hadn't expected. When I answered, her voice wasn't the sharp, cutting tone I had come to dread. It was raw, trembling, and unfamiliar. "I miss her," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "Mom?" "The baby," she clarified, her voice breaking. "I miss her. Every day." I leaned against the counter, gripping my phone tightly. This wasn't the mother I was used to. This was someone stripped bare of anger and pretense, someone vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. "I'm sorry," I said softly, unsure what else to offer. She let out a shaky breath. "I know I've said terrible things. I blamed you. It was wrong." I stayed silent, letting her words come at their own pace. I needed someone to blame," she admitted. "It hurt too much to think it was my fault. Or your father's. Or just life." The honesty in her voice startled me. My mother, who had spent her life crafting a perfect image, hiding behind control and blame, was finally letting the cracks show. "I don't know how to do this," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you live with the loss of something you never even got to hold?" I closed my eyes, her pain washing over me. For all the resentment I felt toward her, for all the hurt she'd caused, this was a moment where the humanity beneath her flaws shone through. "You grieve," I said gently. "You let yourself feel it. And you stop trying to bury it under everything else." Her silence was heavy, and I wondered if she was crying. I couldn't imagine her crying, not the woman who had always held herself so rigidly together. "It's hard," she said finally, her voice breaking again. "I thought I'd done everything right. I thought if I just kept it all together, nothing like this would ever happen." "You can't control everything, Mom," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Sometimes things just happen. And blaming yourself, or me, or anyone else, won't change that." There was another long pause. "I know," she said eventually. "I know that now." I swallowed hard, unsure what to say. This was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from her, and while it didn't erase the years of damage, it felt significant. The next time I saw her, she looked smaller, her usually perfect posture slightly hunched, her eyes tired. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as we sat down at the cafe. I nodded, studying her. The woman who had always seemed so invincible now seemed fragile, her grief clinging to her like a shadow. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, stirring her tea absently. "About letting myself feel it." "And?" I prompted. "I don't know how," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long pretending everything's fine, even when it isn't." I hesitated, then reached across the table, resting my hand on hers. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "You start small," I said. "You let yourself cry or scream, or just sit with it. And you let other people be there for you, even if it feels uncomfortable." She looked down at our hands, her expression conflicted. "I've never been good at that," she said. "Letting people in." "I know," I said softly. "But maybe it's time to try." The conversation didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years of resentment or magically mend our fractured relationship. But it was a start. For the first time, I saw my mother not as the woman who had controlled and hurt me, but as someone deeply human, someone who carried her own pain and flaws and was trying, in her own way, to make sense of them. And while I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, I was ready to let this moment be what it was. A crack in the walls we'd both built, a chance to see each other more clearly. Her grief didn't excuse her actions, but it explained them. And in understanding her pain, I found a small measure of peace for my own. The decision to file the restraining order wasn't easy. I sat in my lawyer's office, the forms spread out in front of me, every word a reminder of how far things had escalated. "You're sure about this?" my lawyer asked, her tone professional but kind. I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly. "I have to be. They've crossed too many lines. I can't keep living like this." She nodded, sliding the papers toward me. "It's a protective step, not just for you, but for your peace of mind." I signed the forms, the weight of the pen heavier than I expected. Each stroke of the ink felt like another barrier between me and the chaos that had defined so much of my life. The restraining order went through quickly. My parents didn't contest it, though I heard from extended family that they were furious. "She's turning her back on us," my mother had reportedly said, her voice dripping with bitterness. But I wasn't turning my back on them. I was stepping forward, toward a life that wasn't dictated by their manipulation and control. The next few weeks were filled with a strange kind of calm. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't buzzing with accusations or guilt-laden messages. The silence was liberating, if a little unsettling. I spent more time with my siblings, helping them navigate the fallout at home. They were my biggest concern now. "You're really not coming back, are you?" my brother asked one evening as we sat on my couch, the glow of the TV reflecting in his eyes. "No," I said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "But I'll always be here for you. And when you're ready, I'll help you get out too." He nodded, his expression determined. "I don't want to end up like them," he said quietly. "You won't," I said firmly. "We're going to break this cycle. Together." My sister, sitting cross-legged on the floor, looked up from her phone. "Do you think they'll ever change?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe. But it's not our job to wait for them to change. We can't put our lives on hold for that." She nodded, her eyes full of understanding that belied her age. With the legal matter settled, I began to plan for my future. I started looking at jobs in other cities, far enough away to build a new life, but close enough to be there for my siblings when they needed me. It wasn't about running away, it was about starting fresh, unburdened by the weight of my parents' dysfunction. One evening, as I packed a box of belongings to donate, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my sister. "Thank you for everything. You're the best big sister ever." I smiled, a lump forming in my throat. The day I moved into my new apartment, I stood on the balcony and looked out at the unfamiliar skyline. It felt like a blank canvas, a place where I could finally breathe. My siblings called that evening, their voices filling the empty space of my new home with warmth and hope. We talked about their plans, their dreams, their determination to escape the shadows of our parents' influence. "We'll get through this," I promised them. "And we'll build something better." As I hung up, I thought about the long road ahead, not just for me, but for all of us. Breaking free of my parents' control hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And now, I was ready to create a future that wasn't defined by their toxicity, a future where my siblings and I could thrive, together, on our own terms. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. And the view was beautiful,